Peter Dawson.
Good morning, my lady. The first witness this morning is Ms. Leslie Fraser.
Repeat after me. I do
solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning. You are Leslie Fraser.
I am.
You have provided us with a number of statements for the inquiry so far. Thank you very much for having done so. If I could just run through them quickly in order that the references can be put on the transcript for those who are interested to read them. You provided a witness statement dated the 23rd of October 2023, which is INQ 000320588. You provided a second statement as a corporate statement as Director General of Corporate, which has the reference INQ 000215474. That's dated the 23rd of June 2023. You then provided an addendum witness statement in the capacity as Director on the 6th of November of this year, INQ 000340111. A further statement, again in that capacity, on the 9th of November of this year, INQ 000340122. And finally, again in that capacity, a further statement on the 4th of January 2024, INQ 000391307. You have signed all of these statements, as I understand it. Is that correct?
I have, yes.
You're familiar with their contents?
I am.
And do the contents of these statements remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
They do.
Thank you. You are the Director General of the Corporate Directorate General within the Scottish Government and a full-time civil servant. Is that correct?
I am.
You've held that role since March 2021?
Yes.
And you originally joined the Scottish Government as a civil servant in 2001. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
You explain in some of your statements that the Director General Corporate is responsible for the corporate services required by the Scottish Government, which includes, amongst other things, corporate governance, legal propriety and ethics, and also you're responsible for the Covid-19 Inquiry Response Directorate. Is all that correct?
All of that is correct, yes.
Thank you. The COVID Inquiries Response Directorate, as I understand it, is a directorate within the Scottish Government which coordinates the Scottish Government's response to this inquiry and indeed to the Scottish inquiries.
That's correct, yes.
I'd like to ask you some questions this morning about a number of documents and practices relating to document retention within the Scottish Government.
Yes.
And as I understand it, this is a matter which falls within your ambit as the Director General of Corporate.
It is. So I am responsible for all aspects of record keeping, but I'm also the Senior Information Risk Owner for the organisation, which carries its own responsibilities as well. But all of that general area falls within my ambit.
Thank you very much. Could I just have the 9th of November statement, INQ 000340122? And you say in paragraph 1 of that statement that the Scottish Government has established policies and guidance in place to support effective information governance and records management. The Scottish Government is committed to openness and transparency and to cooperating fully with both the UK and Scottish COVID-19 inquiries. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes.
And the current First Minister of Scotland, and indeed the former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, have repeatedly committed to these important values as well, including statements made in Parliament to that effect. Is that correct?
That is correct.
These values of accountability and transparency represent a bond of honesty with the people of Scotland. Is that correct?
That is correct. They're absolutely fundamental to good government and a key responsibility as a civil servant, being able to transparently explain what the government has done and why it has done it and how it has done it, and demonstrate that through the record is fundamentally important to good government.
And as such, I think it's correct to say that these principles of openness and transparency and indeed accountability are embedded within the national performance framework, about which we heard a little from Professor Kearney yesterday. Is that correct?
They are in the National Performance Framework, yes, but they're in other places as well. So you'll see them in, for example, the Public Records Act for Scotland 2011, which we are responsible for complying with, and in a range of other areas as well. So it's fundamental to, as I say, how we operate as civil servants in the Civil Service Code, also referred to in the Ministerial Code as well. So cuts in all ways, but everybody is responsible and accountable for that openness, transparency and accountability.
Thank you. I think, in fact, one sees these principles laid out in a number of key documents relating to the Covid-19 response. For example, the framework, which is called the Four Harms Framework from April 2020, and other such documents.
Yes, exactly so. So the Four Harms Framework is setting out how the government would seek to balance what were recognised to be real harms that were happening across society through this tragic and unprecedented set of circumstances, but to illustrate that to the public and indeed, of course, to Parliament and to others who would rightly scrutinise us, so that we could be held to account for the way in which we were endeavouring to respond.
When government decisions are taken, it's important that the people are able to understand how, when, why, and by whom those decisions were taken. Fundamentally
so. And of course, we're accountable, or rather ministers are directly accountable to the Scottish Parliament. And it was critical throughout the pandemic that we had a record of, as you say, who, what, why, when, how. We were regularly sharing that with the Parliament, and Parliament was therefore able to hold ministers to account in live time for the way in which the conduct of the response to the pandemic was being undertaken.
And as regards accountability, it's hard perhaps to achieve accountability if inadequate records of these matters are retained.
Precisely so, and that's why it's a legal responsibility on the government to maintain a proper record and to be able to account for decisions and how those were reached, and to be able to demonstrate that through the public record. And we produce a plan and regularly review that, at least annually, and that is then overseen by the Keeper of the Records of Scotland, who has a legal responsibility to ensure that we are conducting ourselves lawfully in respect of our records management approach.
Obviously, from our perspective, we are looking back on a period of time in the past.
Yes.
And the records such as the ones we're talking about are relevant to our investigation. But is it not also the case that these records are important when dealing with a situation like the pandemic, which is a continuous one rather than a single incident, to be able to access records of the kind we've been discussing in order to inform continuous decision-making?
Absolutely. As I say, it's fundamental to good government. You need to be able to set out what it is that, of course, ministers have asked for advice on, and then demonstrate the way in which that advice has been brought together. And you need to be able to explain and demonstrate how perhaps challenging and different perspectives have been reconciled or brought to ministers' attention, and then you also need to be able to demonstrate the way in which ministers have considered that advice and then ultimately reached a decision, and then of course what the government has done about it, what the impact has been, and so on. You need to be able to demonstrate that process.
I think it would be fair to say, however, would it not, Ms. Fraser, that it would be overly burdensome on an organisation like the Scottish Government if one were to suggest they should retain every piece of paper and every electronic piece of documentation relating to its business?
Absolutely. We could not possibly retain absolutely everything. Excuse me. For example, I think in relation to the handling of the COVID pandemic. We have well in excess of 1 million emails, for example. Now, much of those will be, inconsequential. The job of records management is to ensure that the core elements, all of the relevant information, including when there are disputes and when things need to be reconciled or you need to change course, for example, that all of that is set out, and it's clear then to either, for example, a parliamentary committee looking in pretty live time at what's going on, that you can demonstrate what has happened, or as now, that some years since you can then go back and look at the record and understand how that journey has been undertaken.
In order to achieve a balance between retaining an impossible amount of documentation and documentation of the type that we've been discussing, would it be fair to say that the government and those working for it should be required to consider the kinds of matters we've discussed, the principal aim being that the Scottish public is able to access information which tell them reasonably why decisions were taken, by whom decisions were taken, how decisions were taken, and when decisions were taken.
Exactly so. And we give guidance through our records management policy and plan, and through training, which is mandatory for all civil servants and regularly renewed. We also have a direct responsibility on directors in the Scottish Government to ensure that their teams are acting in accordance with records management policy. So that's where the guidance would be found for civil servants seeking to understand, as you say, how you assemble correctly the full record for inquiries like this, for Parliament, for all the purposes of government.
I understand, we will come to them in a moment, that there are a number of policies which relate to this subject which existed and were current around about our 2 and a bit year scope.
Yes.
You are generally responsible for those policies, is that?
I am indeed, yes.
And responsible for ensuring that they are complied with.
Yes, I share that responsibility for compliance with my fellow Directors General. As I say, the way that, because we're an organisation of 10,000 civil servants, then directors have an accountability for ensuring that records management policy and other policies are fully complied with in their area. And directors then account on an annual basis for compliance through what we call a certificates of assurance process. So that's one way in which compliance would be assured. I also oversee an information governance board for the Scottish Government, and there we look at the ways in which we are encouraging and improving records management across the Scottish Government, where we need to pay particular attention, what needs to be changed in processes that we might have in place. Obviously, it's not an issue that ever stands still. Technology keeps moving on, and there are new questions and challenges as well that mean that we need to adapt and change our records management approach, but the fundamentals still persist.
Because as far as compliance is concerned, it wouldn't really serve a great deal of purpose to have policies if efforts were not made to seek that they were complied with on behalf of the government, its directors and other senior officials. Correct.
We rely on that compliance in order to be able to create that accurate record as we are legally required to do.
We'll come to some of these policies in a moment, Ms. Fraser, but as you are responsible for the COVID Inquiries Response Directorate, we have received a number of these policies in what might, I think, fairly be described as something of a piecemeal fashion. In particular, we issued an original corporate request to you for information, including relating to document use, informal use of documents in the management of the pandemic. And we received a single policy in response to that, which was dated November 2021. We'll come to that policy in a moment. We then required to issue a further Rule 9 request seeking greater information, and this over time resulted in a number of further policies becoming apparent, and indeed we received some policies from you only in the last couple of days I think they were directly from you actually, as I understand it. Can you please tell us why it is that it has been so difficult, given your responsibility for the Response Directorate, to get the policies that we asked for some time ago?
Well, I'm sorry if it has appeared to the inquiry and indeed to others involved in this process that has been difficult or complex. That is absolutely not our intention. We've endeavoured throughout to give the inquiry as well and as quickly as we can precisely the documents that you've been looking for. The fundamental document here is our records management policy. The November 21 document that you refer to is if you like, a supplement to that explains in a bit more clearly and precisely how to treat information on mobile messaging.
We'll get on to the detail in a moment. That's right.
Okay, very good.
There is the reason why these documents were produced in this piecemeal fashion, that those charged with locating them had difficulty locating them.
No, I don't think we've had difficulty locating them. I think our understanding of the focus and requirements of the inquiry has very much developed over time as I think the inquiry has become more and more specific in your requests of us. The reason why I provided documents to the inquiry earlier this week is because of a different set of searches that we had undertaken in relation to a Freedom of Information request, which brought up a much longer document which was produced, well, not a document, actually a Saltire article. Saltire is the intranet for Scottish Government employees, and we produced an article in April 2020 as our colleagues were moving out of the office. I think 97% of people were office-based before the pandemic, and that switched entirely, obviously, with lockdown. And this pulled together a whole host of useful information, how to negotiate with your broadband provider, how to get new technology if you needed it, how to get an adjustable chair, a whole range of things. But it also said, in terms of staying in touch, and we were thinking about people's personal well-being, but also the business contacts that people have. We were recognising that applications like Zoom, as well as WhatsApp, were much more prevalent, and people were adapting and finding ways to... Yeah.
Can we go back to the point Lawson was pursuing? The inquiry asked you for various policies,
yes.
And you've just said, or a few minutes ago, said there was one fundamental policy, the records management policy.
Yes.
But instead of sending the one fundamental policy, which you would have thought if it was easy to find, someone would just say, there's our one fundamental policy, off to the inquiry. You sent the 21 policy that was about something else. So why was it a member of your team couldn't find the fundamental policy to send to the inquiry when first asked?
I'm sorry, my lady, I understood that we had provided the record management policy in good time to the inquiry. I've certainly been conscious of referring to that from my statements from certainly last summer. I would have expected that to be on any of my statements.
Maybe I've misunderstood.
No, my understanding, my lady, is that the policy that was provided originally was the November 2021 policy, and that the policy to which Ms Fraser is making reference was provided at a later date in response to a further request.
That is a surprise to me.
Well, it would be surprising, wouldn't it?
It would be very surprising. I would understand that that would have been provided with my witness statements last year. But can I check that point?
And also,
Lady,
we'll get the
please?
team
Yes.
to check it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. If it were the case that one had difficulty locating document retention policies, it might tend to suggest that document retention doesn't work very well in the Scottish Government. Would that be fair?
The records management policy is readily available to colleagues. It's on our intranet site. We train people on it on a regular basis. My colleagues and myself, we must take mandatory annual training on aspects of data handling. For example, the records management policy is referred to through that. So there, in fact, I'm pretty certain it's published on our website as well. So it's a legal requirement that we have a records management policy and a records management plan, and that is approved by the Keeper of the Records of Scotland. So it's not a new thing, and it's absolutely fundamental to the way that we operate.
Okay, thank you. Can we perhaps look at the policy? It is INQ 000309551. I understand this is the Scottish Government Records Management Policy. I think this is the one to which you made reference as being the go-to document. Is that right?
That is the one, yes.
And there is an October 2019 version, which is the one we see here.
Yes.
And I understand it may have been updated in September 2020. Is that right?
We regularly update it, generally on an annual basis. And it's reviewed at least every 5 years by the Keeper of the Records of Scotland. Yeah.
But this one would have been the one that would have been current at the time of the
yes.
period we're interested in, the beginning of 2020.
Exactly so.
Could we go to page 3, please? If we see at the top of the page there, it says the Scottish Government handles a very large amount of information. This information relates to specific topics and individuals, as well as records of decisions made by the government, actions taken, and the rationale behind these decisions. The Scottish Government recognises that its records are an important public asset and are a key resource in the effective operation, policy making and accountability of the Scottish Government. Like any asset, records require careful management, and this policy sets out the Scottish Government's responsibilities and activities in respect of this. Just go back to the original document. Jump down a little bit further. Under scope, it says all employees of the Scottish Government have a responsibility to effectively manage records in accordance with specified legislation and guidelines. And in the next section, this policy applies to all records created, received or maintained by Scottish Government staff in the course of carrying out their functions. And it also helps us with a definition which says a record is a piece of recorded information or document, regardless of format, which facilitates the activities and the business carried out by the government and which is thereafter retained for a set period to provide evidence of a transaction or decision carried out by or on behalf of the government. Records may be created, received or maintained in hard copy or electronically. Emails, SMS messages, tweets, documents, spreadsheets, presentations, database entries, photographs, sound recordings and video may all be records. The policy says that employees of the government have to retain evidence of transactions or decisions carried out on or behalf of government. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Things done on behalf of government may include making decisions, taking action, and the forming of a rationale behind those decisions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would all of those things be deemed to be part of transactions or decisions on behalf of the Scottish Government?
They would all be considered relevant, yes.
This policy does not mention WhatsApps or specifically other electronic information, does it?
It talks about emails, SMS messages, tweets. It's drawing, and I guess in October 2019, WhatsApp was perhaps not as prevalent at that point as it subsequently became. And I think by the time we get to September 2020, so a year later, WhatsApp is then included in this list.
We'll get to that, Ms.
Yes,
but the important point, I think, is that what I think we've tried to do is to cast the net as widely as possible.
We
to
are
cover
indeed.
all forms of communication which may become prevalent in the practice
Exactly so, yeah.
of the various ministers and employees, yes?
Yes.
It states that it's important to retain records relating to the business of government.
Yes.
And the business of government contains and creates information which it records about the business of government Is that right?
Yes.
And this information includes records of not only decisions, but as I think we've covered, actions taken and the rationale behind those decisions,
Yes.
as well as how those decisions were reached.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we then go to INQ 000 274180? Now, as I understand it, this is one of the documents that you were able to provide to us just in the last couple of days, is that right?
That's correct. That's the document. Well, it's a snapshot of what was on our intranet site as guidance for colleagues.
Indeed. And I think, as you told us earlier, this was text that was published on the Scottish Government intranet. I think you called it Saltar.
Saltar, we call it, yes.
In April 2020 as guidance or policy to assist with working from home. Is that right?
Yes, I wouldn't say it was policy. It's much more up-to-the-minute guidance for people who are moving from working in the office to moving to working at home. So it is covering things like how to log on, what to do if you can't get your password to work, all of the things that people would have gone to maybe a person in the office to deal with. And we're now explaining how you can do that when everybody is working from home.
So this was one of the events that I think you contemplated earlier, where there is still the general policy that we've discussed, but this was attempting to try to deal with the particular circumstances that prevailed at the time.
This is a lot of questions that are coming in to us quite understandably, and we're endeavouring to pull lots of information together in a single useful place where people can click on links and get that advice.
If we go to page 8, please. It says, under the blue passage, keeping in touch with colleagues and having social and business contacts during this time is vitally important. Apps like Zoom, Slack and WhatsApp can be downloaded on your Scots mobile, but must be used in a responsible professional manner. When using them, remember apps are for official info only. Messages are only encrypted when in transit. As soon as they arrived on your device, it depends on your security settings. Messages are subject to freedom of information. Messages should be transitory and not used as the official record. Messages should be deleted as soon as they are no longer needed. The guidance to Scottish Government officials encourages the deletion of messages which might relate to business, doesn't it?
It tells people, this is quite shorthand, I would say. So when it says apps are for official information only, that is actually referring, for example, to our security settings. So nothing above official level, so sensitive information or secret information, for example, can be used.
I'm focusing slightly more on the final bullet point.
Yes, but I think the second to last bullet point is important as well. So they're transitory and they are not the official record. Therefore, you need to write the relevant information into the official record, which is what the record management policy requires you to do. And we are rightly pointing out to colleagues that they are subject to freedom of information as well.
Is it clear here that matters require to be written into the official record, as you said, before they are deleted?
That is because we're talking about them being transitory and not the official record. That implies to me that therefore they must be written into the official record if they're relevant to government business.
Is your position that it is clear?
I think in the context of this, which is a section about connecting with colleagues, yes, that is implied and clear to experienced civil servants.
The requirement to write it into the official record comes from the first document we looked at, isn't that right?
It comes from that document, but it comes from the way of working as a civil servant. Government cannot operate unless civil servants are writing the relevant information onto the corporate record, and it's searchable. We can look at it when we're taking forward policy, and we can respond to queries and requests, scrutiny in Parliament, freedom of information, for example. So the whole way in which government works depends on civil servants ensuring that information is on the record at the earliest opportunity.
Would this also apply to ministers, surely, as well?
Ministers are not subject to our records management policy. That is a matter for civil servants. So ministers, for example, don't have access to our electronic records management system directly. They could not write information onto the record. Ministers work with their private offices, and when a minister comes into office, their private office explains to them how decision-making, the transfer of their views to other ministers or to stakeholders or to policy officials will happen. That private office will explain that if a minister has a meeting without private office being present, for example, then that information must be relayed to private office at the earliest opportunity so that private office can, one, act on it, but two, also record that for the record, because, again, what ministers are doing is of fundamental importance and interest, not just to government, but to Parliament and to others who want to scrutinise our activities.
But these rules that we are looking at must also apply to ministers by extension. Is that not correct?
Ministers are required under the Ministerial Code to work positively and productively with the civil service. They must, it's clear in the Ministerial Code, for example, that should they have meetings where civil servants are not present, they must relay that to their private office, and so that the relevant actions can be taken, including the information recorded to the record.
So simply put, do these rules apply to ministers? Do not? Because the reason I'm asking is because we have asked the Scottish Government for its policies relating to the way in which information requires to be retained for these purposes in its key decision makers, including ministers and senior advisors.
Indeed.
So are there policies we have not seen that relate to ministers?
No, there are not. It's what I'm trying to explain is that it's the civil servants who have the responsibility for record keeping and not ministers directly. Ministers have a different set of responsibilities about how they work with their private offices, and their private offices have that very important responsibility for ensuring that the actions of their minister and the communications from their minister are then recorded in the record. So I'm just trying to draw that distinction between responsibilities.
I understand. So if ministers were to refer to these policies as their understanding of the rules that pertain to them, would they be wrong?
They're not wrong because they provide good guidance and advice, which ministers
but
can...
But surely, Ms Fraser, not for them, you're telling me.
Not directly for them in relation to the retention of records on the corporate record system of the Scottish Government, but it provides good guidance and advice in terms of, for example, how you would treat WhatsApp messages on your private phone if they were relevant to government business.
If I were a minister at the beginning of the pandemic, keen to know how I would comply with my obligations, if this policy does not apply to me, surely I wouldn't look at it.
You would be made aware of the relevant aspects that, and as they do apply to ministers, by your private office. So that's a responsibility of private office, and then a responsibility of ministers to work well and productively, including the transfer of information to private office so that it can be retained on the record.
Where can we see for ministers the obligations defined in this regard with this degree of specification from this period?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite...
Where can we see, applying to ministers, the guidance pertaining to their obligations about the retention of records with this degree of specification?
So this degree of specification would be well known and indeed was discussed with ministerial private offices, and ministerial private offices are then supported to be able to have the conversations and the discussions with their ministers about how they will then work. There's of course a degree of personal preference about how ministers choose to work with the civil service and choose to work with their private office, but the fundamental points about ensuring that the relevant information is then transferred into email, into the records system is the critical one. And ministerial private office do that working with their ministers. Ministers would have been able to see the mobile messaging policy. It's not a secret policy. It's written from the perspective of civil servants, because civil servants are the ones with the responsibility, but the good practice guidance would equally apply to ministers.
Is the good practice guidance a different document that we haven't seen?
No, it's contained not in this document that we have in front of us here, but in the mobile messaging policy in 21.
There were a number of press articles in 2023 when matters pertaining to retention of documents became a live issue being addressed by the Scottish Government, where former ministers, including former Health Minister Alex Neil, suggested that when he was in office, he frankly couldn't understand the policies as to document retention. Is it really surprising that ministers are in that position, given the fact that what you have told us is that these policies relate to civil servants and that there is some more general obligation, poorly defined it seems, relating to ministers?
I would say that the obligation on ministers is not poorly defined. I think it is very clearly defined in the ministerial code that they have a responsibility and accountability to let their private office know at the earliest opportunity of meetings and discussions that they have that are relevant to government business, that where a civil servant is not present. If a civil servant is present, then it's the responsibility of the civil servant to take that note. I think Mr Neil left office in 2016, so potentially arguably before WhatsApp, for example, became prevalent as a means of informal communication. But Mr Neil would at the time have had advice before 2016 about how to work with his private office and ensure that his meetings, decisions, views were then transferred into the record and were acted on by the civil service.
You've said on a number of occasions that private offices would do things with regard to speaking to ministers about their obligations. Do you know that that is the case, that happens?
I do know that that is the case, yes.
It's your job, I think, to oversee that to a certain extent.
Ministerial private offices sit within my area of responsibility. For example, I know that as part of the induction process for new ministers after the May 21 election, we specifically spoke to ministers about handling data and information well and looking after data securely. And that was part of the induction process for ministers. Fundamentally, and I think actually the Deputy First Minister referred to this in Parliament, if ministers don't tell their private office about every aspect of what they've done, nothing in government will happen. Ministers may talk to each other or talk to a stakeholder. If that's not relayed, then no action will be taken by the civil service.
But what you're telling me is, during the period with which we are concerned, ministers were definitely told by their private offices that they required to comply with these policies as regards not only general documentation and information, but the specific types of electronic communications that we have mentioned here.
We would have said, well, ministers would be aware of the necessity of talking to their private office, as I've said. The level of specification about WhatsApp and the mobile messaging policy was something that was developed towards the end of November 21. So at that point, we would have been discussing that across our organisation, and at that point, private offices would be aware of that and discussing it. I think actually in my evidence pack, I did see an exchange between a private office and a minister where they were discussing precisely this at the beginning of January 22. So that gives me, again, just a second check that indeed this was being discussed.
I'm afraid I'm not following. I'm a minister and I'm talking to Mr Dawson, who's another minister, in a WhatsApp message, and no civil servant is part of the group.
Yes.
What am I, or what's Mr Dawson told to do with our WhatsApp messages? In clear terms, what are we told? Are we told in accordance with this policy that seems to be delete them when they're not needed? Or are we told to keep them? Are we told to tell the civil servants at a private office about them? What are we told in clear terms?
Assuming that this is about government business.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, chances are if I'm a minister and Mr Dawson's minister, it will be, isn't it, really?
It could be.
Unless we talk about having a cup of tea, I suppose.
You could be having a cup of tea, or it could be party business. But assuming it's government business, then you would agree, right, I'll tell my private office to do X, Y, or Z as a result of the conversation that we've had. And that is the general way in which information that is perhaps discussed between ministers would then be relayed to the civil service so that action can be taken.
But that may not record the rationale which Mr Dawson got you to agree is one of the things that ought to be recorded. That would just be recording the actions to be taken as a result of our decision. So in other words, things could get lost if the ministers delete their WhatsApp messages without telling private office everything that was discussed or forwarding them to private office.
Mr Dawson was talking to me earlier about the process of agreeing what's relevant government business here. So ministers couldn't, for example, meet without civil servants in the room and say, we're determining to set up a new grant scheme here. Right, I'll tell my private office the new grant scheme will be set up. Impossible to do that because there's a whole set of other checks and balances about the expenditure of public money, about value for money test, about accountable officer responsibilities. So a minister would say, I've spoken to my colleague, we'd be interested in advice on setting up a grant scheme that could do this. Will you please get me the relevant advice? And private office would then say, ministers have spoken, they're keen to do this. Can officials please provide the advice? Now, all of that then is part of the official systems of the Scottish Government that is generally handled on email. That's where decisions and advice from ministerial offices comes from. And then the civil service will provide that advice, and that is where the decision then would be assessed and taken.
Well, I'll leave Mr Dawson to pursue that. Can I just pursue one other question that I had in relation to the passage we had highlighted, APSA for official info only. You said you thought it was clear to experienced civil service. Of course, not all civil servants necessarily as experienced as you are. But I confess that I don't find these rules or principles clear. If messages are subject to freedom of information requests, my immediate instinct would be to say, well, if it's going to be subject to an FOI, then I've got to keep it. Yet the final principle says messages should be deleted as soon as they're no longer needed. That seems to conflict with the fact that they need to be kept in case somebody, representative of the media, say, makes a freedom of information request.
Yes.
Is that clear? I don't think that's clear.
This is a snapshot, a much longer document which relates to a whole set of issues for people moving home and working from home when they have been working online. And this is a section about connecting with colleagues, both personal colleagues and business colleagues. The apps are for official information only. Certainly says to me that's for nothing that is sensitive, nothing that is secret, because those official is a recognised security marking within government. And because messages are transitory and are therefore not part of the official record, that says to me, therefore, anything that's relevant must be on the record, and then you should be deleting that transitory information as soon as it's no longer required, which is also part of good practice.
So I don't think you've addressed my point, but Mr Dawson, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Ms Fraser, who monitors compliance with these policies?
As I've explained, the responsibility sits with directors. We have over 50 directors in the Scottish Government, and they're responsible for ensuring the compliance of their teams with these policies, along with a range of other policies. That is then annually assured through a certificate of assurance process. In addition to that, I chair an information governance board of the Scottish Government, and we look across the piece at the issues that are emerging, at where we need to make improvements, and so on. And we target the resources of government and our actions to ensuring that we are making the necessary improvements. So that's another form of assurance. We also have the opportunity to bring in our internal audit colleagues as well. So, for example, in relation to material that we've provided for this inquiry, we've on 2 occasions asked our internal audit colleagues to just check that the approach that we've been taking looks to them to be sensible and in line with the questions that the inquiries have been giving to us. And then we've been obviously acted on the recommendations that have come back.
How do these compliance bodies know if ministers and or civil servants are corresponding with each other by WhatsApp, which of course happened during the course of the pandemic about government business, whether the policies are being complied with if you know nothing of the correspondence?
If the civil service knows nothing of the correspondence, then action will not be able to be taken within government.
Does that not create a very significant risk, Ms Fraser, given that you've acknowledged that during the course of the pandemic, it was known from April 2020 that people were going to be using these various new media of communication, that people could well be corresponding about the business of government and that not being retained on the corporate record?
I think that what I would say here is that the 3 things were happening, I think, here. One, we were moving from most people face-to-face in the office to the vast majority of people working from home. At the same time, we had access to new technologies. I particularly remember Zoom being fundamental to the way that we were working in government. And there were quite rightly questions about how that would work. I think the third thing is that the process of producing information for this inquiry and indeed for the Scottish inquiry has made us reflect on the way in which these new digital records are being created. So I can see from the evidence that I've been referred to in preparation for today that there's a great deal that is informal, that is preparing for formal meetings, which then I know will have appeared on the record. But nonetheless, we're creating a digital footprint, a digital record, where previously none, I think, would have occurred before. For that reason, we are already looking at our record management policy and the way in which WhatsApp and other mobile messaging apps are handled within our records management approach.
Does this not mean, Ms Fraser, it is encouraging to hear that the Scottish Government is taking action as a result of its experience of this inquiry? However, is it not the position that the Scottish Government had no control over the use of these messaging systems and the retention of any messages that were sent via them involving ministers or civil servants during the course of the pandemic?
I would disagree with that, because it was necessary for government to be able to function that information was being relayed to civil servants and was then being handled through the formal systems of the Scottish Government, our email principally, but records management and so on. No action, no activity of government could happen without that. And at the same point, we were ensuring that those records were being added to the record so that we could understand the steps that we had taken during the pandemic. We could be held to account in Parliament in live time. And we were also then, from very early on, aware that there was likely to be public inquiries and that we should be preparing for those. So that is why we've got very significant amounts of information that we've been able to provide to the inquiry. I think more than 19,000 documents of that sort. And that is the very fundamentals of government. Those are the the decisions and how they were reached, and you could see all of that set out in those records. What I've seen in the WhatsApp exchanges that I've been pointed to is colleagues preparing for those exchanges, and then information potentially duplicated on WhatsApp, but then clearly going into formal records and onto email, for example. So I wasn't at the time conscious that this was a problem, and believe that we have been able to, and we do have a comprehensive record. However, I think that this has shone a spotlight on a really important issue to do with, what these WhatsApp exchanges convey and what that means in terms of the records that government might look to keep in the future. And that's the area that we want to look at now in our review.
Ministers and civil servants were permitted by the Scottish Government to use these messaging platforms to speak about government business during the course of the pandemic. Is that not correct?
That is correct, up to a certain level of security, yes.
They were allowed, for example, to use their own mobile phones for that purpose.
Ministers, on some occasions, chose to use their own mobile phones if they were dealing with...
I've asked whether they were permitted to do so.
They were permitted to, ministers were permitted to.
Does it not mean in these circumstances that, as you've said, none of these issues have arisen during the course of the pandemic for the various compliance bodies that you've mentioned? Is it not inevitable that that would be the case when people are using apps, using personal phones over which the government can have no possible control?
For government business, which ministers might want to conduct on a personal phone, the only way that could happen is by installing a secure app on their phone. At the time, it was a mobile BlackBerry app that they were using, and that enabled them to receive emails to their secure government account on a personal phone. So that was available, I think, until March 23 as one option for ministers. Rather than taking a government phone, they could install the secure app on their personal phone and use that mechanism.
Would an exchange between a senior minister and a political advisor in September 2020 relating to the number of people who should in Scotland be permitted to attend weddings or funerals fall within the definition of government business?
It would.
Should that have been retained on the corporate record?
Not necessarily that artefact, but a decision like that that would have been discussed through our formal processes. So you would see email exchanges on that, you would see evidence and advice on that. The exchange, I think, between Ms Sturgeon and her Chief of Staff would be, I wasn't part of that conversation, obviously, would be for them to explain, but would be an adjunct to that formal process.
We received, in response to a request made of the COVID Inquiry's Response Directorate, a very helpful table, if I may say so, on the 13th of October 2023, which I referred to at the third preliminary hearing. The table is to be found at INQ 000319509. And in that table, your staff, I think, provided us with summaries of the position of a number of senior ministers who were involved in key decision-making during the course of the pandemic on a number of issues, including their retention of notebooks and things like that, but also in relation to the extent to which they had used or had retained messages relating to the pandemic and how it had been managed. In the summary table that we see here, we can see that under the box Nicola Sturgeon, it says that messages were not retained. They were deleted in routine tidying up of inboxes or changes of phones unable to retrieve messages. So what that tends to suggest is that at the time a request was made, Nicola Sturgeon, the former First Minister of Scotland, had retained no messages whatsoever in connection with her management of the pandemic. Is that correct?
That's what that indicates to me.
And when we asked the government whether it had retained any such messages on its corporate record, you provided us with none.
Correct.
Does that mean that we have no access to the former First Ministers of Scotland's messages in connection with her management of the pandemic?
Yeah. The way in which, Ms Sturgeon will be able to explain this much better.
I think that's really just a matter of logic, Ms Fraser, which I'm asking you to help us with.
Yes. Ms Sturgeon would have worked with her private office in order to ensure that her views and instructions were clearly understood. And they may well have been informed by some of the exchanges that she'd had with her Chief of Staff or with other ministers, but she would have relayed that to her private office, and that would be then the instruction that went from private office, and that would be retained on our corporate system.
Do you know that to have happened?
That is how, as I say, that's how government works. It's a necessity for that information to be captured.
So is the answer to the question, do you know that to have happened? No.
It's hard for me to give absolutes in relation to a general question.
It's just about your own knowledge, Ms Fraser. Do you know that to have happened or not?
My knowledge, my experience is that we've been able to find the relevant information and to demonstrate how those decisions were made, and to evidence that through emails and other exchanges on our corporate record system.
But if you don't have access to Ms Sturgeon's messages, and she doesn't have access to them anymore, how can you know whether the relevant information has been transposed onto the corporate record? How can you give the answer you've just given?
Yes, I can't know, not having seen all of the information.
Could I just refer you to, very briefly, to page 2 in connection with the former Deputy First Minister? His position was that messages would have been deleted by auto-delete functions or by themselves manually deleting them as they do on a regular basis. So the former Deputy First Minister's position appears to be that he had messages set up on an auto-delete function. Was that something that was permitted?
The use of WhatsApp was permitted on Scottish Government devices. How ministers and private offices chose to manage that on a day-to-day basis would be a matter for them. So it may be that Mr Swinney spoke on a daily basis and explained what he wanted from his private office, and then ensured that information was deleted thereafter, so that he was able to manage what would quickly, I suppose, become unmanageable amounts of information. How ministers work with the private office, I think, is the critical area.
You mentioned a moment ago, I think on a few occasions, that it was the responsibility of the directors to ensure compliance. Is that right?
Yes.
And what ultimately that meant was compliance by both ministers and civil servants, although they worked directly with the civil servants who were making sure that the ministers did it. Is that correct?
Yes. So, yes, directors are responsible for ensuring that their teams are absolutely maintaining our corporate policies and approaches, including on records management. That includes the Director for Ministerial Private Offices, who would have been ensuring that this was working well through the pandemic.
Would it surprise you if it were the case that a Director General had encouraged people in a group relating to the management of the pandemic to delete their messages?
I would be surprised if they encouraged them to delete without ensuring that relevant information was retained. I know that some WhatsApp exchanges tipped into what I would call banter and, you know, on some instances, I think, personal support for colleagues as well. Now, that, I would argue, is not relevant for the corporate record of the Scottish Government, and therefore would not be something that should be retained. And I would expect colleagues to remind people of that as well.
To follow up on a question that Her Ladyship asked earlier, if that material was deemed discoverable by freedom of information request, would it automatically require to be kept on the corporate record?
The matters for the corporate record are the ones that are relevant to government business and the who, what, why, when, how, where. The freedom of information requirements do not include what they call ephemeral information.
But
so,
on the assumption that it were covered by the FOI requirements, would that mean that it would require to be transposed onto the corporate record and therefore not deleted?
We are required to produce anything that we hold, any information that we hold under the freedom of information response, and therefore where, for example, somebody to ask for all WhatsApp messages pertaining to a decision on X, then were they held, then those would be discoverable under freedom of information. Now, not all of that information, if, for example, it was about the football last night, would be relevant and therefore ought to be recorded on the government record system.
Does the Scottish Government place any automatic backup on government-issued phones?
We automatically back up and indeed sync from our government systems. So we have a set of government systems called SCOTS, and whether those are on your mobile or on your laptop, they will automatically be backed up for a certain amount of time.
Was that the case during the course of the pandemic?
Yes.
For people who use their personal phones for communications relating to government business, is there any similar system?
Yes, if, for example, ministers were using the secure app in order to be able to receive emails, then that would be covered by the backup system.
WhatsApp messages on a personal phone be automatically backed up to the system?
No, they would not. That would depend on the settings that the individual put in place.
Would anything other than the emails on the secure system that you've just mentioned be backed up to the secure system?
No, we would not back up information on ministers' private devices other than the information on the secure app.
I understand that between December 2022 and September 2023, the Scottish Government carried out an upgrade of its corporate mobile phones. Is that correct?
It is.
And you've helpfully provided with a statement in relation to that.
I have, yes.
Is the result of that the messages contained on the phones of a number of individuals were wiped effectively from their systems?
Yes, I understand that 3 individuals have said that they lost messages as a result of that upgrade.
That's 3 individuals in a list of people that this inquiry was interested in contacting for their involvement in decision-making in the
Yes.
pandemic. There will have been a lot of other individuals, but not people that related to our interests.
Yes, the guidance that people had very clearly alerted them to the fact that if they had non-government systems or apps on their phone, they would need to back those up. Separately. That was, I think, number 1 instruction for colleagues.
The instructions came from you in that regard, I think, didn't they?
The instructions, yes, came from my digital team. So we provided training, we provided, again, Saltire articles and advice, and we sent emails to every single person affected to explain to them the process and what they needed to do step by step.
Did you ensure that the information that was given was complied with?
As far as we were able to do, yes. Again, working with a large number of officials, we rely on directors to ensure that their teams are aware and complying.
Could I just ask you one final question, Ms Fraser? In all the circumstances that we have discussed, would you accept that the Scottish Government's document retention policies were simply not fit for purpose during the course of the Covid-19 pandemic?
I wouldn't accept that they were not fit for purpose during the pandemic, and I think that's evidenced by the sheer number of documents that we've been able to provide and the end-to-end story that sets out. I would accept, and I think this is very much learning and understanding the hurt and frustration that there has been as well. of not being able to receive all the WhatsApp messages, for example, that we therefore do need to look again at this new digital trail that is being left by informal messaging, and to consider what that means for the good operation of record management within government. And I'd be very happy to keep the inquiry updated on that work, if that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. In the finest traditions, really, having said that's the last question, there's one matter I'll return to. It was on the issue of the records that had been provided with the first corporate statement. The first Director General corporate statement, which was provided by Ms Fraser, disclosed one version of the records management plan, which was undated, the November 2021 messaging apps usage policy to which we referred. The plan was an operational document and did not set out the policy itself. Further requests were made by a further Rule 9 request, which again resulted in a further Rule 9 response from Ms Fraser. The October 2019 Scottish Government Records Management Policy, which is the main policy that we've been looking at, was only disclosed to the inquiry on the 11th of October 2023. Is that your understanding, Ms Fraser, or are you prepared to take that from me that that's the case?
I'm sure that you've investigated that. Thank you. If we've got any other information on that, we'll of course come back to you.
I think the key point about that, as her ladyship said earlier, was that if this was the obvious policy, one could quite obviously have reached for it and provided it to us along with the November 2021 policy with the first corporate statement. Is that not right?
Yes, I think I would like to consult my team and just check on that point. Thank you.
My lady, I understand that there is one co-participant question, and Ms Mitchell.
Ms Mitchell.
I'm obliged, my lady. There is also a Rule 10 application which was made, which has been sent to the inquiry. So perhaps if I'm asking my first question, they might have a look at that. It was simply arising from something that was said.
Okay, if someone could send it to me. Thank you.
I understand from my junior it's been sent off.
I've got shaking heads, but anyway.
A little while ago, well, my lady. I'm obliged to my learned friend counsel to the inquiry for asking many of the questions which the Scottish COVID bereaved were interested in asking. I want to move to a slightly separate issue just now, and that is the response in relation to public messaging. You've given us a full statement in relation to public messaging, but I only have a very narrow issue to ask you about, and it's this. The UK government, in our earlier part of the module, Module 2, it was shown that there were a number of messages which were wrong that were given publicly. And by that I mean that either identified the wrong place to which they applied, because ministers referred publicly to the UK or this country or Britain, when they were actually meaning England. England as the UK, I believe, was a phrase which was used. What I would like to know from you, Ms Fraser, was there any need for a correction of the UK government's public health messaging that you were aware of? And was there any discussion within that and any action taken?
I don't have here information about whether there was a particular instance, but I know that there were regular weekly meetings between my own communication and marketing colleagues and their counterparts in the UK, and a great deal of time and effort was spent on trying to ensure that there were not contradictory or misleading messages applied through communications and marketing activity. I think, for example, we had in place the facts messaging from, I think, with stakeholders from late May 20, and then in use generally in June 20, and Hands Space from the UK government was then something that they launched later that summer, is my understanding. Now, clearly we had traction and awareness and understanding, and employers and other institutions were bought into and using the facts messaging. So there we worked with the UK government to try and ensure that there wasn't confusion by overlaying a separate set of messages to a population who were already, we were observing, working very hard in order to comply with these protective behaviours.
So I see you understand that detail, but my specific question related to the difficulty of the problems that were being evidenced by the UK government being unable to distinguish between these on occasions. Do you personally have any understanding of whether that or not that was addressed by your team?
My team did have regular discussions, for example, about communities living in the borders, you know, who were for example, receiving perhaps contradictory information or difficult to understand information about, for example, train journeys that might cross the border. So there, the teams were working together to try and ensure that as far as possible, we were giving clear, consistent, actionable advice to people who were keen to respond properly.
But I might just press you and focus in relation to the problem that was identified of the UK government getting that message wrong. Are you aware specifically of anything of that nature?
I would need to check with my teams whether there were specific examples. I know that generally the position improved over the course of the pandemic, so it was more problematic at the outset. I think, for example, the change from stay-at-home message was something that we were unaware was going to change to stay alert, and that caused a problem at the outset.
Yes, I think the inquiry is aware of that. Okay. Yes, I don't need any further information in that regard. Okay. Lady, I don't know whether or not you've had...
I think the question has landed. Mr Dawson, you're going to tell me...
The position is, I think, that the subject, although we're very grateful to Ms Mitchell, the subject has been covered in the questions we've already put to Ms Fraser and her extensive statements on the matter.
What is the question?
The question pertains to the deletion policy and whether it's... the question is, I would like to ask what the rationale was for deletion given the FOI obligation, which I think we've covered.
With the matter I was pursuing?
Indeed, which I think has been covered as far as I'm concerned.
You've got a minute, Ms Mitchell.
The question is this: what's the rationale for the deletion of records when it would seem eminently sensible simply to hold on to those records in case someone FOIs you?
Indeed. We can't physically retain everything.
No, I'm talking about individuals on their WhatsApps or their text messages.
Yeah, we're concerned about security. Different messaging systems can have different vulnerabilities, and obviously government ministers or civil servants need to reduce the vulnerabilities if on phones that are being used for government business. We're also concerned that if, for example, there are long WhatsApp exchanges that might contain personal information, sensitive information about individuals that would be covered, for example, by the GDPR, data privacy, that those should not be retained. Government shouldn't be holding information that is not relevant to government business, and therefore that should be reviewed, got onto the record, and then deleted at the earliest opportunity.
And we touched briefly on the issue of FOIs. Yes. If when someone asks you to show them the retained information you have, yes, it's only relevant at that particular time. So if it's deleted, you don't have that obligation. But you do have an obligation to do something to tell them either when it was deleted or to explain your policy. Is that correct?
We have a general responsibility, actually, under the Public Records Act, to explain what our retention and deletion policies are.
So prior to 2021, before the addendum came up, how were people able to know what that policy was?
So under the Records Management Act, it's clear what the document retention policies are that we agree with the Keeper of the Records of Scotland. In relation to WhatsApp messaging, we would be first of all, saying to people, if it's relevant to government business, get it onto the government record. That's the number one thing, because we can't search easily.
Well, I understand. I understand the issue. So what I'm saying is
once it's on the record, then for security, data privacy, and a whole set of other reasons, please don't retain information for longer than it's required.
But if you have to give an explanation for why such a policy is in place, or for deletion, or the fact that it's been deleted, we don't actually have one directly in relation to ministers.
Ministers don't have the responsibility directly to write information onto the corporate record. That is the responsibility of civil servants.
I think I've taken enough of my lady's minute.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. And in fact, the email was sent to the M2 inbox, not the M2A. That's why it took a while to track it down.
My apologies. I'll make sure
So,
that's
not your fault. I just thought I mentioned it so it doesn't happen again.
Thank you.
11:30.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr.
Thank you.
Ms. Razor.
Mr. Dawson.
The next witness, my lady, is Mr. Kenneth Thompson, CB.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
You are Kenneth Thompson.
Correct.
Could you please try to speak into the microphone, Mr. Thompson, as best you can? You have provided, I think, a number of witness statements to the inquiry, for which we are very grateful. The position, in your regard, is slightly complicated, and I think there were some statements which you had some responsibility for compiling, but were actually signed off and finalised by others subsequent to you leaving post. Is that correct?
I saw those, they were compiled by others on behalf of the Director General. I saw some of that material before I left post, but as you, I think, are saying, some of it was signed and submitted to the inquiry by my successor.
Yes, let's try and go through, and just to be absolutely clear, which ones you're responsible for and which ones you've had involvement with. There is a witness statement from you dated the 9th of November 2023 under reference INQ 000343888. That's your statement?
It is.
And you've provided a number of other corporate witness statements as you were at the time, the Director General for Strategy and External Affairs for our module. One was dated the 22nd of June of this year, INQ 000215495, and a further statement dated the 23rd of June, INQ 000216655. These are also statements that were compiled and signed by you?
Yes, they were.
Do these statements remain, the contents of these statements remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
They do.
And just to clarify, my lady, the two corporate statements covered slightly different areas which fell within the area of responsibility of Mr. Thompson at the time. A further 4 witness statements have also been provided by, I think, the Director General for Strategy and External Affairs. We understand you're familiar with 2 of these statements as you provided them in draft prior to leaving post. Is that correct?
I would need to see them to know which ones I saw before.
Let's just run through them. I don't want.
You're going to go through them.
I don't want to be asking you questions about ones that you're not responsible for, Mr. Thompson. The first was a supplemental statement dated the 26th of October 2023. It's INQ 000348720. This statement, you may recall this one, I think that you did have an involvement with it. It was a supplemental statement of that date relating COVID-specific structures of the Scottish Government, such as SCORE, the COVID Directors and the 4 Harms Group. Well, that was one, I think, that was compiled by you, possibly, but then signed by your successor, Mr. Griffin. Is that correct?
It was seen by me and provided in draft, as paragraph 1 confirms.
Thank you very much. And the second statement, similar to that, was INQ 000339039, a statement dated the 1st of November 2023. Oh, that's a different one.
That's not the statement I see before me.
I'm afraid. There was a second statement. We'll come back to that. I understand also that 2 further statements were provided on behalf of the Directorate General, of which you were previously associated. These were provided by your successor. The first dated the 5th of November 2023, INQ 000366267.
I have a different number in front of me.
Oh.
Yes, I now have 267 before me.
Yep. Have you seen that statement at least? This was one
That one, I think, was prepared without my involvement.
Right, okay. And a further statement dated INQ 000362632. This is one dated the 6th of December, providing a correction to the previous one. I think, again, that was provided by your successor.
Yes,
Did you have any involvement in that one?
No, I would be. That's highly unlikely.
Thank you very much. We'll just return to the other number in a moment, but deal with your personal background. You initially joined the civil service, as I understand it, in October 1988, is that
That's correct?
And since late 2011, you held the role as Director General for Constitution and External Affairs, which, as I understand it, was renamed Strategy and External Affairs in February 2022.
That's correct.
I'll refer to could you just tell us that that's a directorate family, is that correct? It's a term we heard from Professor Kearney yesterday. Is that a directorate family, and could you tell us what that is?
It's a family of directorates. Mm-hmm. So as Professor Kearney said, the Scottish Government structure is a number of directorates supporting portfolios. The mapping isn't quite one-to-one, and directors, leading directorates, are managed by a Director General, and a Director General's span of command is informally known as a family.
Right. So you are in charge of a Directorate General, and under you will have been, at different times, a different constellation of directorates.
Yes.
Thank you. And in your work, I understand that you supported the First Minister, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet, including on cross-governmental work.
I had two broad areas of support to ministers. The first was what you've just summarised. The second was support to a portfolio cabinet secretary in relation to a number of different matters which changed over the period of the inquiry, but that's probably less relevant.
Yes, but your responsibility included those matters that I mentioned.
Yes, it did.
You explain helpfully in your statement ending 343888 at paragraph 6 that this role is analogous to the role of the Cabinet Office within the UK government. Is that a fair description?
It's broadly fair. It's the best way I have of describing what my role is, but it's not exactly the same. The principal difference is that the Cabinet Office is coordinating actions across separate government departments, whereas I and my teams were coordinating action within one organisation, working across directors, as you've described earlier.
Thank you. You retired from the civil service in November 2023.
That's correct.
And I understand that you were awarded the Companion of the Order of Bath in the most recent New Year's Honours List. Is that
also correct?
I'd like to ask you some questions about the subject which we've just been covering with one of your former colleagues, Ms Fraser, which is to do with document retention policy. We heard evidence yesterday about a number of important framework documents which set out the principles which are designed to guide decision-making within the Scottish Government, including the National Performance Framework. These documents include, amongst other things, a commitment to transparency and accountability. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
These are important documents which lay out principles with regard to the way in which Scottish Government aspires to conduct its business.
Correct.
And these principles apply both to ministers and to civil servants, as you used to be.
Indeed.
There are a number of documents, I think, that reiterate the commitment to these principles, which emanated by means of guidance to the way in which decision-making would be made in the pandemic. For example, the framework relating to the Four Harms strategy from April 2020.
That's correct.
Indeed, during the course of the pandemic, the Scottish Government's public communications strategy was also consistently said to be based on openness, honesty and accountability. Is that correct?
Correct.
We've heard evidence from the current Director General of Corporate, Ms Fraser, about the Government's document retention policies and the importance of keeping records. What is your understanding of the Scottish Government's policy on the use and retention of informal messaging such as WhatsApps as at the period with which we're interested from 2020 to the end of the pandemic in April 2022?
So I think this will be a longer answer than my answer so far. So at the period of the pandemic and the requirement to stay at home, our use of electronic messaging grew very rapidly for obvious reasons. And at the early part of that period, we had a number of corporate tools to make that possible from memory. The main one was Skype at the time, later replaced by Teams. But in order to coordinate the work that we were doing, there was also a need to contact people rapidly using, for example, messages that would show up on their phone if they were away from their where they were working at home and so on. So we used a number of different, people would use a number of different tools to contact each other. Coming to records management, the key principle there is to create and maintain the formal record of government decisions, what decision was taken by whom, when, and on what evidence. In my experience, corporate decisions were taken in the formal Scottish Government systems, including their IT systems. So principally that would be the Scots email system. And my understanding of the use of, or my practice in the use of informal messaging would be, as I describe in my witness statement, to contact or be contacted by others in order to share an important piece of information that had just become known, or to say, I've sent you something by email, you need to look at it right now, or the First Minister wants to see you in St Andrew's House in 2 hours' time, or messages of that sort that needed to get into my attention rapidly. Okay. So most of these messages didn't contain material that would be relevant, a salient fact, I think is the way it's captured in the relevant policies. But where there was a salient fact relating to government business or pertaining to a decision that was in contemplation, it would be my practice to transfer that into the corporate systems, usually by sending an email within the Scottish Government system saying the First Minister has asked for additional advice on subject X, or something of that sort. And then having done that, I would not retain material relating to government business in non-government systems. Again, as later confirmed in the mobile messaging policy, the instruction to us was to transfer salient points and then to delete the messages. So that's what I did.
Okay.
You're very softly spoken. I don't know if you always were. Or, but if you could speak up a little, I'd be very grateful.
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Just for the sake of clarity, Mr Thompson, I think you may be referring to the paragraph in the November 2021 mobile messaging apps usage policy, about which we've heard a little, where there is stated at obligation, at least monthly, but preferably at the earliest opportunity, you must transcribe the salient points of any business discussions and or decisions. Was that your understanding of the position?
Yes, as the date shows, that policy postdates the start of lockdown and the work I was doing. Mm-hmm. But that was my understanding of the application of the records management policy to informal messaging platforms at the time, and indeed is has been my practice for many years. Yes,
so that may have used a particular form of wording, but effectively that had been your understanding of the obligation throughout this period.
Yes. And
it's just you use the phrase salient facts, which might be interpreted slightly differently from that wording, but that wording is what you always thought the obligation was.
Yes, you're always thinking as a civil servant, what are the decisions under contemplation here? What is the evidence that would go into the public record that decision was taken by whom and so on? So if I use as an example, some of the decisions taken by governments, plural, in the course of COBRA meetings in March were taken very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And part of your mind as a supporting official is thinking, a decision in that COBRA discussion was taken. It was taken by my First Minister. I need to capture that. I need to make sure that is part of the formal record. Mm-hmm. So that's what you're doing. In ordinary times, most of that is happening routinely, solely in corporate systems. You don't need to send anybody informal messages about it. But where there are messages which say, for example, a realistic example would be the First Minister say she might message me to say we're having a meeting in 2 hours' time. I need additional briefing on such and such. Mm-hmm. And if I couldn't provide that to her myself directly immediately, then I would transfer that into the formal system to say the First Minister needs briefing on such and such. Now that's not actually that doesn't evidence a decision because there's no decision in that. But that was my practice, is always thinking, what do I need to transfer into the formal system?
Mm-hmm. I think you talked in your description about the importance of understanding not just the decision, but on what evidence were the words that you used. just like to clarify what you mean by that. Would you agree with me that that would require the corporate record to contain information relating to the way in which decisions had been taken, by whom they had been taken, the advice that had been tendered and accepted or not accepted, and any discussion which contained information of that nature?
Yes. The gold standard for this is a decision by Cabinet. And it will always be clear, and I believe it is clear from the materials in front of you, that Cabinet would receive a paper which would set out in a lot of detail the evidence, the options, the consideration, the advice, the recommendations, and then continuing the chain of evidence, as it were, the Cabinet conclusions will set out what decision ministers took and give an account, not a verbatim account, but an account of the discussion which had led to those decisions. So when things moved at pace in such a way that even on the very intense pace that we were working with Cabinet at that time, a decision was being taken away from Cabinet more rapidly, you would want to capture that same set of evidence. So, for example, just after the May 21 election, before the First Minister was still the First Minister, because there is always a First Minister, but she had not yet been nominated by the Parliament for reappointment. And at that point, we had an emergency within an emergency, because we had information coming from the scientific advisors about a new variant, the Delta variant. And I think some of the messages that you have from me at the time show the Chief Medical Officer contacting me. I think not in the messages, but separately, he had rung me to tell me this news, and the two of us had gone to brief the then First Minister. And then there's a rapid exchange of messages about, first of all, how we brief the First Minister, and then secondly, what does this new information bring back into play decisions that the government has already taken and announced about moves between levels? And if it does, on what basis will those decisions be taken? And I think somewhere in that message chain there is me commissioning formal advice from one of my team to the First Minister about that decision. From memory, again, that was not a decision taken by Cabinet, because at the time we didn't have a Cabinet. The Cabinet could have met. That was provided for in the pre-election guidance. But in the event, including partly because she was to be asked an urgent question in the Parliament even before having been nominated, the First Minister would need to be transparent with Parliament about her thinking. But in fact, what she decided to do was take a decision and tell Parliament what that decision was. So we recorded that decision. And of course, it's also apparent in the record of Parliament what that decision was.
Thank you. Ms Fraser told us that it was part of the responsibilities of directors and directors general to ensure that there were compliance with these policies, to make sure that all of the matters we've discussed ultimately ended up on the corporate record. Did you do that while you were a Director General?
Yes, I did. In fact, that was not an onerous responsibility, in the sense that most of my dealings were with the First Minister, and the First Minister didn't take decisions in informal messaging. It would be very rare that she would message me or at all, never mind in order to make a decision. So most of what we were doing was speeding up the formal decision-making processes that we were used to using, which would be a written submission, a reply from the private office, or a draft Cabinet paper, a circulated paper, a discussion and Cabinet conclusions. So there was little material, in my experience, that certainly not relating to decisions, that needed to be transcribed from my informal messaging into the corporate record. However, I think I say this in my witness statement, looking back, the use of these messaging systems was much greater because we weren't in the same physical building. And it was possible, and I think the evidence shows that this happened, that different people interpreted the policies in different ways. So although I had no messages to give you, you recovered some from others. I see that many of my colleagues were keeping messages and I wasn't, so that's an example of the risk that I allude to in my witness statement.
Okay. Could I take you please to some messages to have a look at them, just to understand your approach in this regard? INQ 000331192, please. That's at page 5. This is an exchange from the very beginning of the, or very near the beginning of the pandemic, in the first lockdown, the 25th of March 2020. This comes from a WhatsApp group chat that was provided to us, and the WhatsApp group was called WhatsApp Group OROG. Can you recall what that was to do with?
Yes, I can.
Could you tell us what it's to do with?
I'm sorry.
Could you tell us, please, what the group was to do with? What were the business or the
So the group called OROG was, from memory, a group of directors and me and some other directors general, which came together shortly after the lockdown decision. I think OROG stood for Operational Response Oversight Group. It was an informal group. It wasn't a formal part of the Scottish Government's governance or decision taking. And it was really a place in which these directors could, as you would say formally, maintain situational awareness, so we could understand what was going on and what needed to be done. So we were keeping an oversight of all of the different activity that was going on, so that, for example, within the health directorates, people were standing up new programmes on shielding. Within other parts of the organisation, people were moving resources from one place to another because of what we could see we would need to do. And OROG was a group that kept oversight of that. I think it fed back to directors in written form within the Scottish Government systems, but it also had a WhatsApp group in which, out of our group calls, we were able to share information, and I think that's what this thread will be.
So this is a piece of correspondence between you and someone whose name has been redacted, in which you say, my next strategic prediction, this particular individual is about to remind us to clear this thread. And then a person says, no need, Ken, you have already done it, thank you. This seems to be you acknowledging that there will be clearance of the messages from this group, despite the fact it involves business discussions relating to the pandemic. Isn't that right?
No, this is quite an informal group. It is discussions about the pandemic, but it's not a forum in which decisions, especially not ministerial decisions, were taken. There are no ministers as part of this group.
Did it involve business discussions?
Yes, it's about do we have the right people in place to do that bit of work? Have we got adequate cover? So, for example, one of the topics I remember being part of this was concern for the welfare of staff, in that we know that in emergencies, if you're running an emergency 24/7, you will need 5 people to cover one post, allowing for 3-shift working and for people to have some recovery time at weekends and for sickness. And at this point, we thought that many of our staff might be absent sick. So one of the things we were discussing in this was what later became called the rule of 2. In other words, have we got key roles doubled up so that we've got some additional resilience? So there's those kinds of discussion going on.
These are business discussions, are they not, Mr. Thompson?
Yes, but they don't lead to, as I'm describing them here, they don't lead to decisions by government.
As I read out to you a moment ago, the obligation, which you told me had been the obligation throughout your period as a civil servant, was that you had to transcribe the salient points of any business discussions and or decisions. So discussions required to be, salient points of discussions required to be retained on the corporate record, do they not?
So the test I'm applying when I'm looking at this material is, does this material need to be part of the record? And the record is described and defined in our records management policy in relation to decisions taken by government. What I'm describing is conversations among civil servants about making sure that we're able to support the business of government. So it's business in the sense that it is our work, but it doesn't relate to decisions taken by ministers as part of the government. That's the distinction I'm making.
That's simply not what the policy says. This is discussions, business discussions. If someone, for example, wanted to know what were these directors discussing about this rule of 2 at the time, perhaps someone had been dissatisfied with what you had ultimately decided, they would need to know, would they not, what discussions had taken place in order to know how the ultimate position had been reached. What you're suggesting here is that there's an early, almost pre-discussion clearance of the thread.
No, I don't think so. I think these are business discussions, and from them, any salient points would need to be transferred into the corporate record. And the test that I'm applying is, we've had a discussion about how we're doing our business. Is there something here that affects, that needs to be part of the record of the actions of government in responding to the pandemic? If that's, I'm a bit worried about person X, they've got caring responsibilities and their work's just exploded. That's not, if I apply the test, does that need to be part of the formal record of government decisions? I don't think it meets that test.
The test should, of course, be defined by the policy and not subjectively by you.
I'm making a judgment about the whether this example of information meets the criteria set out in the policy to be part of the formal record.
Okay, could we go to INQ 000268017, please? Page 10. And again, there's an exchange here. This is dated a bit later. This is from August of 2020, and there are a number of people in this chat. The group is called Covid Outbreak Group. Do you remember that group?
I don't recall it, but it sounds entirely likely that I was part of it.
Yes, you were part of it, because we can see the messages from you. There are a number of other people we can see. They include Nicholas Stedman, who I think was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And Jason Leach, who was the National Clinical Director.
Yes.
And in this, there's a discussion which starts with you saying, just to remind you, seriously, this is discoverable under FOI. Know where the clear chat button is. To which Nicholas Stedman replies, yes, absolutely. Jason Leach then replies, DG level input there. And then you say, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now clear it again. And then Jason Leach says, done. And you say, me too. Is this you encouraging people in advance of messages being exchanged relating in a group called Covid Outbreak Group to delete messages in order to defeat FOI requests?
No.
What was your intention when sending this message?
You've shown me one part of this. I think probably what has just been said is something that it might have been a bit of personal disclosure, or it might have been something that seemed to me not to be a useful thing to say in a group like this, because it might not relate to the purpose of the group. I don't know, I can't see what it was that prompted me to say it. What I have said is that this channel is discoverable under FOI, which I believe to be correct. That doesn't mean it needs to be kept. It needs to be important. There's the FOI rules operate in that way. But the records management policy, it relates to information which is kept. So I'm reminding my colleagues that this channel is discoverable under FOI, which I think is correct. And then I'm saying in an informal way that my understanding of our approach to these groups is that messages should not be kept other than in relation to salient points, as we've just discussed. These messages should not be kept and should therefore be deleted.
Okay. You mentioned the possibility that there had previously been some personal discussion. If there were personal discussion, that wouldn't be recoverable by FOI, would it?
If it is information held by the government, then I would need to probably take some advice on that. But if I run through, supposing that there had been an FOI request for an informal messaging channel, I would first of all make sure that we had clearly what information we held, and that would include information in informal messaging channels and in people's notebooks and so on. So the first step in dealing with an FOI request is to make sure you know what information you hold. Then you decide, you apply the terms of the request to discover, to decide what's in scope. Is this information in scope? Then you consider whether there are any relevant exemptions from the FOI legislation, and those are also set out in FOISA, the Freedom of Information Scotland Act. And then you consider in relation to most of these exemptions, whether the public interest test applies and whether, given that, the information should be disclosed, even though there might be a relevant exemption or more than one. So that's the process you go through.
You used the phrase, plausible deniability are my middle names. Now, clear it again. You're suggesting to these people in this discussion, prominent people in the Scottish COVID response, that they should, as a matter of instinct, clear their messages to defeat FOI requests, are you not?
No, I'm responding to Jason Leach teasing me by saying that's a DG level input there, by bantering back, if you like. But what I'm saying is, unless material is salient and relevant to the public record, and in which case it should be transferred, and then all of the material should be deleted. That's what I think later our corporate policy would say.
Thank you. INQ 000268025, please. Thank you very much. Again, this is a group which is intriguingly named Quantum of Omicron, from again later on. It says in the group, starts off with you speaking, I feel moved at this point to remind you that this channel is FOI recoverable, to which someone named Penelope responds, clear the chat. Someone called Jim McMiniman says, happy to do so. LAN reduced from 51 to 39, but fair comment. And then Jason Leach says, WhatsApp deletion is a pre-bed ritual. Again, does this indicate, Mr. Thompson, that there is a culture amongst people who are prominent advisors or decision makers in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland to delete their messages in order to defeat the very purposes for which the policies are set up?
I need to give you a longer answer to this question, but the short answer is no. The longer answer begins on a point of fact. In fact, I think this is not the quantum of Omicron exchange. It's because
you may be right about that, Mr.
This is much earlier than Omicron. I think this is actually a set of messages about the Delta variant.
Yes.
And this is relevant to the point I want to make. I think I said earlier that we had an emergency within an emergency when Delta emerged in Glasgow just after the Scottish elections. And these messages are from that time. And earlier in this thread, because I do recall this thread, Jason Leach has posted into the thread a message from Twitter. And I have therefore gone to see what is that message and why has Jason posted it in. And the context here is that we know that there is a new variant of the virus. We think it's in community transmission in Glasgow. We think that it's between, I may be wrong on the details, but it's 40 to 80% more transmissible. It's significantly more transmissible. And it's spreading primarily among members of the Indian and Pakistani community who are very well represented in Glasgow. The same variant also got a hold in Bolton. And final bit of context, in 2 days' time, Rangers supporters are planning to march through Glasgow to celebrate the fact that their team has just won a trophy. And Jason's tweet is, not his tweet, the tweet that he posted into this group is from a diehard Rangers supporter reporting a food safety expert as saying that there is little or no risk to Rangers fans if they march through Glasgow on Saturday. And I know I guess how Jason is going to feel about that. And he's envisaging what actually happened, which is that thousands of Rangers fans did march against the regulations then in force, against the advice of the Scottish Government and the police and Rangers Football Club, in very closely packed. And thousands of people there, many of them will have had COVID, more of them will have had COVID by the end of that march. And some of them will have got ill and some of them may have died. So I'm imagining how Jason is feeling about that as a clinician. And given his role in communications, that he's going to have to be the person who says, well, I'm a doctor and I say that you shouldn't march. And they say, well, there's this other doctor who says you can. And what I'm really doing, I accept in an oblique way with my reference to FOI, is saying, take a deep breath before you comment about the tweet you've just posted, Jason.
The reference to the phrase by Penelope, clear the chat is somehow reminiscent, I think, of the phrase that you used in the previous message, now clear it again. Was that a phrase that was used to describe this ritual of clearing the WhatsApp messages?
Well, it is used there. To repeat a point from earlier, that was in fact the instruction that we were given in the corporate policy, having transferred any salient points to the corporate record.
Again, the discussion that you're talking about relating to the Delta variant emerging, thank you for putting it in its context, is a business discussion between you and other senior advisors advising the government about their response to COVID. Is that not right?
No, I think if you read the whole of that group, what you see is a group of colleagues coordinating rapidly on logistical matters. And in fact, yes, it's a business discussion in the sense that you used the term earlier, I should say that. But I think elsewhere in that, I ask my colleagues, does this have implications for the decisions already announced by ministers? And we have a discussion about whether the UK government is likely to change its position. And we conclude that it does have implications. And what I then say somewhere in this group is, then we need advice to our ministers. And I think I commissioned Dominic Munro, who's also a member of this group, to write that advice and to send it to the First Minister within the formal systems. And I think that's what was done, leading to a rapid decision, I think I referred to it earlier, in relation to both Murray and Glasgow as local authority areas. So yes, it's a business discussion, but there are no decisions about the exercise of government power are taken here. There's no decision here about whether Glasgow would remain for longer in level 3, which is the issue in question. What we identified was a need for ministers to have advice. In fact, the First Minister was telling us in no uncertain terms that she needed advice on this. And we were making dispositions about who was going to cover a Four Nations meeting with the UK government, who was going to write the advice, who was going to support the First Minister in her preparations for answering an urgent parliamentary question and so on.
Could I ask you, please, Mr Thompson, to try to speak slightly more slowly? If it's of any consolation to you, I'm being similarly admonished, so I'd be very grateful just for the sake of this.
We will both do our best in that case.
Yes, thank you. Could I just ask you to go over the page, please, to the second page of this chain? And I think we see there at 1819 in the middle, this is the same change we were looking at before, which you very helpfully pointed out is not quantum of Omicron. My understanding is that it was subsequently named quantum of Omicron. It has a rather odd collection of letters and numbers, which is meaningless.
I don't think that's correct.
Right.
There was a group called Quantum of Omicron.
Right.
From my memory, it was started by the then Chief Medical Officer in order to share rapidly emerging information about the Omicron variant, but that group was not this group.
Thank you. I'm looking at the entry there at 14th of May 2021 at 1819. It says, Ken Thompson updated the message timer. New messages will disappear from this chat 7 days after they're sent, except when kept. Is that you putting an auto-delete function on the message group, such as to delete messages automatically, whether they relate to government business or not?
It's me doing what I say in my witness statement was my practice. What I would do is transfer salient points into the corporate systems where that was necessary, and I would do that weekly. The later policy said at least monthly. And then having done that, I would delete the messages because salient points had been transferred and the rest didn't need to be kept. And I say in my witness statement that where the messaging platform provided a way of automating that process, then I would use it. I think by the 14th of May, the decision in relation to extending Glasgow's period in level 3 had been taken and announced. I think it was announced that earlier that day. So I was probably anticipating that there would be little or no additional traffic on this. In fact, from memory, the next step in decision-making about Glasgow on level 3 was at the meeting of the Cabinet on the 1st of June, which would have been the first meeting after the election. And the Cabinet had a long submission from me, unusually not a cabinet paper, but formal written advice, 30 to 40 pages of it, on the basis of which ministers took a decision at that point to move Glasgow into level 2. So I wasn't anticipating that that there would be much more traffic in this group, and therefore I switched on something that would save me the work of coming back to it in a week's time to check whether anything had arisen.
Again, just above that, you see one of your colleagues, I think, using the phrase clearing the chat that we saw earlier. Is that right?
So yeah, she's confirming that she too is following our practice and indeed our policy of not retaining messages that didn't need to be kept.
While we're on this exchange, I was just quite interested in some of the things that aren't being discussed there more substantively, Mr. Thompson. You can see a message from you slightly before that at the top where you say it was really useful to have that full Four Nations ministerial call led by the PM to share all the information and responses so that communications could be aligned, wasn't it? And then you say not. And then Gregor Smith, who was the Chief Medical Officer, says, Cobra, anyone, ? And then there is a reference to Penelope Cooper saying, I feel a cost benefit for FM would not have been positive. I wonder if you could explain to us what it is that you're discussing at that time. You've already given us some helpful context to what was going on at that point. But there's reference to a Four Nations ministerial call, and it seems, on our interpretation, that you're perhaps slightly sarcastically suggesting that the meeting was not useful, although the words suggest that it was.
So I will try to speak slowly on this because I've got a lot to say. So I was going to say that, yes, looking at that, I was being a bit sarcastic. I will explain why. So I've already referred to this being an emergency within an emergency and the Delta variant, and I mentioned Bolton. So relevant to, and I've also said that the First Minister had already taken and announced a decision that Glasgow would move to level 2 shortly after these exchanges. And the question that we were considering with the First Minister, including in a discussion that the CMO and I had with her, I think on the 12th of May, was whether the new information that we had about the Delta variant called that decision into question. The reason for that would be that the level and the NPIs associated with that level in which Glasgow currently was, the decision on that would have been taken on the basis of the epidemiological characteristics and situation at the time the decision was taken. And that would have been on the knowledge that we had about the infectiousness of the virus at that point. If the virus, if there's a new variant of the virus which is, let's say, 50% more transmissible, and it's in community transmission among communities that are where spread will be maybe easier because you have larger households or multi-generational households, and that might involve more risk. You might have more cases and more risk, and that means the decision that you had already reached, there is new information here that means that you not only could, but you would have to revisit that decision. So that's the context. And the UK government faces this challenge in relation to England as well, and I've mentioned Bolton, there were other areas too. Very similar considerations, communities, and so on. And in that circumstance, if I wind back to the period running up to the original stay-at-home decision and then shortly after that, there was better at that time opportunity for governments to align their policies, including through COBRA, and in relation to, outside COBRA, in relation to these matters through more or less formal calls, sometimes led by Mr. Gove. But what we had been doing, I think, just shortly before these exchanges, was watching live on the television the Prime Minister making what I think was a delayed announcement, and I think he said he gave his assessment of the new variant. But he did not, in fact, announce any different decisions about restrictions. The first we knew that was going to be what he said was when he said it live on television.
So your point, I think, here, to take it succinctly, is that there was information which you obviously had to be able to say that, and you're saying that that's information which it certainly would have been useful for the reasons you've set out, the similarity in the communities, etc., to have been shared with you on your Four Nations ministerial call. Was it a consistent theme of your involvement in those calls that information which would have been useful to you was not always clearly shared by the Prime Minister or representatives of the UK government?
Yes. Just to give one bit of context here,
Thank you.
when I say it was really useful to have that full Four Nations ministerial call led by the Prime Minister to share all the information and responses, what I'm saying is that didn't happen.
Yes, I follow.
There was a Four Nations call, I think from memory led by Mr Gove. I wasn't part of it, but Penelope Cooper supported the First Minister in that call. The Delta variant was mentioned, so I knew from Penelope's feedback from that it was of concern to all Four Nations, but Mr Gove had not indicated what the UK government's decision in relation to Bolton or anything else to do with Delta would be. So what I'm saying, I'm trying to be succinct, but what I'm saying is that I did not feel that there had been a useful exchange between the governments of the kind that would have been appropriate in relation to a rapidly emerging new variant.
Mm. This is obviously an important moment, isn't it? There's a significant threat at this stage.
There is.
And I asked you whether this failure to share information was something that you had experienced before. This is significantly into the pandemic, and I think you said yes, that you had previous problems of this nature. What did you, in your senior position, do to try to improve these meetings and other relations with the UK government in order to try to access the information which you thought would be important to the Scottish government's response?
So I think it may be helpful if I answer in two parts. And the first is at a high level and across the period of the pandemic to say why I said in passing that I thought that the intergovernmental relations had deteriorated somewhat.
Yes, please.
And then the second is to answer your point about what did I do about that. To be as succinct as I can, I would contrast what I've already said about the position here in relation to Delta with the exchanges in late March and in April and May, first of all in relation to introducing the stay-at-home requirement, and then, and perhaps more pertinently, in relation to the first review of those restrictions and how that would be approached. So I recall a Four Nations call on the 7th of May, I think, in which the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland were engaged in a discussion with the Prime Minister in which...
We may return to that particular aspect in a moment.
So I can be more succinct in that case. That was a good exchange. And if you're going to come back to it, I can unpack what I mean by that. If I contrast that with what I've just described, you'll see that I think that there's a deterioration there. So what did I...
Just to be clear, a deterioration after the early May exchanges, is that what you're saying?
So I think I would characterise that by saying that in the run-up to lockdown, there was pretty good, albeit that this was all happening extremely fast. But my First Minister was in Cobra. Often in other circumstances, I might have had to argue for her presence there, which I would do by contacting my counterparts in the Cabinet Office. So she was there, so that's good. I think I've described the May exchange to which we may come back. In that exchange, my First Minister was arguing for continued close liaison so that it didn't mean that the decisions of the four governments would be the same, but they would have the opportunity to exchange information and their intentions beforehand, rather than discovering what each was doing by reading the newspapers. But by this point in May of 2021, that effectively was where we were.
I'd like to ask you a few questions now about a separate subject, thank you very much, which is to do with the...
I'm sorry, Mr Dawson, I didn't actually give the second part of
my
my
answer.
Sorry. What did I do about
Mr.
it?
Dawson, please.
There were, during this period, it was part of my job, I should start by saying, I was responsible for the quality of the relationship between the UK government and the Scottish government. I might put that differently by saying I was supported by ministers in that relationship. what the outcome was depended on what ministers did with it. And in that role, I had close, constructive, professional working relationships with a series of opposite numbers and other contacts in the UK government, largely in the Cabinet Office, although during the pandemic, my counterparts there also moved into Mr Gove's department. And I have a reasonably good network in Whitehall more generally. So what I was doing, as I felt that there was insufficient bandwidth in the relationship, was using those contacts, which were both formal and informal, to put the case for more frequent contact and liaison, both formally and informally. So to give examples, if I became aware that, for example, the Prime Minister was going to visit Scotland, because it would be a courtesy that the UK government would tell us that, then I would contact my opposite numbers and say, is there a possibility that we could arrange a discussion? Would the Prime Minister be willing to come and see the First Minister? Because if so, I'll go and ask the First Minister if she would agree to that. And that did actually happen with Mr Gove. I can't recall that it happened with Mr Johnson. Mm-hmm. I might also say, would it not be useful to have a Four Nations call about this? And that did happen, in fact. So to nuance what I said about a deterioration, things improved somewhat from memory in September of 2020, when I covered this in my statement, when there was better bandwidth, and that led to a meeting out of which the four governments published a joint statement about their strategic intent in relation to coronavirus. And I thought that was a good thing. Mm-hmm. From memory, I wrote the first draft of that statement, and I was pushing my contacts to say, I've written something that my First Minister shouldn't have a problem with, and I don't think the Prime Minister should have a problem with it either, because it brings together what all these ministers have said. Would it not be a good thing if we got all the four First Ministers together and asked them if they agreed that, because then that could be set out publicly as an expression of their commitment to work together, and indeed that happened, so that was positive. But then shortly after that, we had an opportunity, as I say in my witness statement, the governments had an opportunity to align their approach to tiering or to levels, but in the event that didn't happen. And well, there was some degree of alignment. I could say more on that now, or you might wish to come back to it.
Could I just ask you, in that regard, on the discussion opportunities and decision-making and information sharing mechanisms, could we go to INQ 000233375, please? Sorry, just give me 2 seconds.
That looks like an internal Scottish Government document.
Yes, no, that's not what I'm looking for. Could we just look for context at INQ 0002333? Oh, that's the same reference, sorry. I'll ask you this without necessarily going to the document. You're referring there to there being, I think the general characterisation of your position was that there were early opportunities to be able to use connections that you had to be able to try to promote intergovernmental relations. There was a deterioration in those. In particular, I think you pointed to things that happened around May. Is that correct?
I'm listening carefully to your question. You put it to me that there was a deterioration in my contacts with my opposite numbers, which I would not say was the case. There was a deterioration in the opportunities that ministers had to come together for these discussions.
Yes. Can you tell us what the nature and state of the relationship between Mr Johnson and Ms Sturgeon was during the course of the pandemic?
I can tell you what my observation of that was.
Yes, please.
I'm sure you'll take evidence from Ms Sturgeon herself.
Yes.
So I'm going to go back before the pandemic. I was present supporting Ms Sturgeon at her first meeting with Mr Johnson after he became Prime Minister. And So the context here was, in a conversation after that meeting, she and I were contrasting the style of this Prime Minister with his predecessor. And my observation of that discussion, and the First Minister kind of confirmed this in the conversation afterwards, was that it had been a conversation among two senior politicians. I think the First Minister's phrase to me was, you can have a debate with him. She was contrasting that with her experience of his predecessor. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that the relationship was warm or that they were clearly not politicians of the same view. Mm-hmm. But at that point, I think, speaking for myself, not Ms Sturgeon, I was more optimistic that it would be possible for that relationship to become productive. I think...
Did it?
The short answer to that is no. But I think I want to give you a more nuanced answer, which is that in the early stages of the pandemic, there was serious engagement between all ministers in the COBRA meetings and otherwise. I didn't see party politics in those discussions at all. And that was also present in the early lockdown period as these discussions began to, ministers turned their minds to when would the restrictions be lifted and how. I think in the meeting of the 7th of May, to which, again, we may come in more detail, but I think that was the first point at which I was concerned that well, I'm going to distinguish the decisions and the relationship. It was clear to me in that discussion that it was quite likely that the Prime Minister would decide to release restrictions in England sooner than my First Minister at that point thought was right, given the facts and circumstances before her in Scotland. So there was going to be a difference between the approaches of the two governments. That is not in itself a problem, but I thought I could also detect at that point that the course of this relationship was going to go in a different, they were going to diverge in terms of their ability to do work together, because the Prime Minister was assuring the First Minister that he wasn't going to release anything on the very day, and she makes this point in the meeting, when the newspapers had headlines like "Freedom Beckons" and "Magic Monday." And I thought, there's something not quite joining up here. And from that point on, I think it became harder for there to be the same kind of four governments coming together, discussing decisions, taking decisions each for their own jurisdiction, which might or might not be the same, but would have been discussed in that way. And in my statement, I used the term alignment for this. Alignment doesn't mean that the outcome is identical, but there was good alignment, and that alignment, the opportunities to create it, and therefore the alignment, deteriorated over the period of the pandemic, with the exception of the period around September 2020 that I referred to earlier.
Right, thank you. There's some documentation in relation to opportunities that there were for the governments to coordinate their responses. For example, the ministerial implementation groups, which we've heard something about in Module 2 already. And some of the documentation suggests that there was a degree of dissatisfaction with those in the Scottish Government, in particular as regards the observation made in a number of places that there were no substitute for head of governments getting together and really being able to try to work out a consensus approach. Would you agree that that characterisation, both of the ministerial implementation groups and the fact that there were no substitute for Mr Sturgeon and Mr Johnson getting together to make proper decisions together, is an accurate characterisation of the Scottish Government's position?
Yes. In your earlier question, you asked me about the relationship between the two heads of government.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. So it's useful for me to add, answering this question, that under that there was a good deal of intergovernmental discussion. I don't wish my earlier answer to give the impression that there was no contact. There was a great deal of contact, including through the ministerial implementation groups. And actually also in relation to the JMC, which I know is of interest to the inquiry. Although the JMC in plenary did not meet in this period, the JMC Europe had been very busy on Brexit business and continued to meet through this period. So there was a lot of that. And the participation in
Just for clarity, Mr. That's the joint ministerial committee on which the Scottish Government and the UK Government are both represented, is that correct? That is correct.
It's the forum created by the Memorandum of Understanding at the time of devolution.
Thank you.
And it meets in different formats, and JMCE it's Joint Ministerial Committee, brackets, Europe, close brackets.
You were telling us about the relationships between the two
Yes.
figures.
Your question was about the quality of the interaction and the satisfaction with the interaction in the ministerial implementation groups.
Yes.
That they existed and that Scottish Government ministers took part in them was, I think, welcome and useful. But did they achieve the potential for alignment, to use the language of my statement? I don't think they did.
What was your interpretation of the reason for that?
I think a combination of factors. I think the UK government had a significant challenge in reaching these decisions because it had, well, a broader range of responsibilities over a larger geographic area, point one. Point two, a much larger group of ministers in the cabinet. Point three, a different institutional landscape with separate departments rather than portfolios and directorates within one organisation. And point four, part of my role was to kind of look in on this and discern what I could. When in an informal message, I said strategic prediction. Quite a lot of what I was doing was trying to work out what the UK government strategy was or would become so that I could help my ministers to understand that and to align with it or to consider whether that was relevant to the decisions they were taking. So part of my job was trying to work out how the UK government was taking its decisions, and that was quite hard to do. And in my experience, those decisions tended to be taken quite late, in the sense, I don't mean late in epidemiological terms, I mean if there's a MIG, a Ministerial Implementation Group, going to happen, the UK government will direct its mind to those issues only relatively shortly before the meeting. And then, final point, the UK government finds it uncomfortable to take its decisions with a Scottish Government minister or another minister in the room. So although our ministers were participating in these meetings, they sometimes had the impression that ministers had decided, UK ministers had decided beforehand what needed to happen, and they were kind of playing that through the discussion once our ministers were involved in.
Thank you. And I had asked you another element to this, which is whether these ministerial implementation groups, with which you've described a certain degree of dissatisfaction on the part of the Scottish Government, were an adequate substitute for the two leaders coming together to try to work profitably together in the interests of both parts of the United Kingdom. And it is your position that the relationship between those two did not work well to the detriment of both nations' responses?
So in supporting work between governments, and this is also relevant to the relationship Mr Sturgeon had with, for example, Mr Drakeford and the First and Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland. But in supporting that, a number of things are in play. Within government, there's a constant pressure for issues to get escalated, and there's a constant battle on the part of those supporting the heads of government to delegate. So anyone supporting a head of government wants to make sure that their energy and time and attention is only being taken by the things that absolutely have to come to them. Mm-hmm. And if I put myself in the shoes of my counterparts supporting the Prime Minister, they would be wanting to ensure that his time and attention were not taken up by things that the First Minister of Scotland thought were important, but he might not. So that's a fair point.
When you say they were making sure that was the case, could you just clarify what you mean by that?
What I simply mean is that it is part of the role of the people supporting head of government to triage the issues that are clamouring for attention, and it's entirely proper that those supporting the First Minister would say, the First Minister of Scotland wants to speak to you. What priority does that have within other things that are on your agenda? However, and my next point is that it's therefore necessary for heads of government to be able to delegate liaison and decision making and so on, including in intergovernmental forums, and that was part of the purpose of the ministerial implementation groups. So where you do need head of government direct participation in decision making, as you did in the COPA meeting of the 23rd of March, it doesn't mean that you need it on decisions about travel restrictions to Spain sometime later. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay. That's preparatory to the answer to your question. It is important for there to be a relationship of trust between heads of government such that if my First Minister thinks that actually the Prime Minister does really need to know this, they should be, she should be able to get through to him, and vice versa. And in my experience, that didn't happen. It was not. The relationship had not been built up in peacetime, it's a metaphor in my witness statement, in a way that allowed it to be deployed in the particular circumstances of COVID. And to come to the final part of your question, yes, I do think that affected whether the decisions were the best they could have been. I shouldn't say that without particularising why I do say that. So if I come back to levels and tiering, I can speak to the reason why the Scottish Government took the decisions it did, and indeed so can Ms Sturgeon. But there was an opportunity, perhaps briefly, for tiers and levels to be brought together in a system which could have been promulgated for the UK, or at least for Great Britain, with clarity. And that would have been easier for ministers and communication teams to do than having two separate systems. And in the event that didn't happen. But and just to expand briefly on two further points, because they do bear on this. It's reported, I think in the inquiry's documentation, there's a reference to the First Minister saying that she proposed to introduce a 3-level system. That's not actually correct. It was reported.
It was reported. That's
what she actually said was, I have been discussing with the Prime Minister their proposal for a 3-tier system, I think something of that sort. Mm-hmm. And indeed she had, or we had information a bit late in the day perhaps, but we knew what the UK government was thinking about. In the event, she concluded that a system of this kind was required in Scotland, that it needed to have more than 3 levels because I think in her view, a level 3 would not be adequate to suppress the virus at all points. So you needed a level above that, and also you needed a level below it because you might want to make smaller steps out to make sure that you don't take off restrictions and then have a second spike. What she did do, though, the reason that the Scottish Government's 5-tier system was numbered 0 to 4, which later was the WHO's recommendation, but that's coincidental. It was numbered in that way so that levels 1 to 3 would be broadly comparable with the UK government's tiers 1 to 3, because in the nature of the NPIs applied in them, they were broadly comparable. So that was her trying to achieve that degree of alignment, but it didn't. In my view, looking back, it didn't succeed in between them. The working between the governments didn't succeed in realising the full potential for that.
Could I just ask you briefly some questions about the very early period of the pandemic? My understanding is that you were involved, one of the things that you were involved in was briefing ministers who were attending COBRA, is that correct?
It's not quite correct, but let me explain. So as you know from my witness statement, my involvement in this began over the weekend at the very end of February, and I won't repeat what I say in the statement about how that came about. But so I was not part of meetings that took place over that weekend. I don't think there were any COBRA meetings that weekend. And I wasn't part of any COBRA meetings on COVID before that, although I have supported ministers in COBRA before. Mm-hmm. From Monday the 2nd of March, I was concerned to support the First Minister in what was clearly a major emergency. And in my then day job, if I can put it that way, my teams and I would have contributed to intergovernmental interactions, usually not so much COBRA because the resilience team would lead on that. But I thought that I could be of support to the First Minister by being around her and in supporting her in COBRA. Not, this is the point I really want to make, not in relation to decision-making on COBRA. The Chief Medical Officer and others were there to support her on that. I was supporting her in my IGR role, Intergovernmental Relations, by helping her to read what decisions the UK government, how the UK government was responding to this emergency, how its decision-making was shaping up, what the opportunities would be. Would it be necessary or relevant for her to seek to influence those decisions? If so, how could she best do that? Those would be the kinds of conversations I would have had with her perhaps before and after COBRA meetings in the very early stages.
Thank you. I wonder if I might just take you to one document briefly, please. The document is INQ 000346137. I'm looking at page 14. Thank you. This is a notebook which...
Could you tell me which of those pages is page 14?
Yes, it's the Wednesday the 26th entry that I'm going to be looking at, which is the top left of the... Yes, there we go.
Forgive me, Mr. Dawson. This is a document you showed me this morning, so I have a
yes,
couple more
absolutely.
questions.
I'm just wanted to ask you about this. This is a contemporaneous notebook.
If I may,
yes.
Wednesday the 26th of what?
This is 2020.
Of February?
Of February 2020.
February 2020.
It's the period that we were just discussing.
Yeah.
Please, I appreciate you didn't have all the documents in good enough time, but please just say, and Mr Dawson
yes.
will make sure that all of us...
Yes, Mr Thompson was kind enough to tell me before we started, my lady, that he had the opportunity to look at the extracts we gave him. So. And
this was one matter of doubt in my mind, was which month is being talked
Yes, thank you for asking me to clarify. This is a notebook which we received from Derek Grieve, who is the Deputy Director of Health Protection Division within the Directorate of Population Health. Is that correct? Is that your recollection?
That Derek Grieve had that role, yes.
Yes. I'm interested really in just understanding whether your recollection of that period, given the limitation of the role that you've described, is consistent with the way in which Mr Grieve is describing the position of the Scottish Government at this stage. He says in relation to this that he attended the Cobra M meeting with CABSEC Freeman. There's Jim Freeman. It's clear all departments in UK government are fully engaged and mobilised in a way that SG simply isn't. And I'd like to ask you then just to go to the Thursday the 27th, his next note, where he says, despite Shirley trying to encourage them, still no real engagement. They then spent 20 minutes talking about internal SG comms, completely amazed. And the page 18, please. It's the Thursday the 5th entry I'm looking at, where it says in the first entry, if we could zoom into that, please. I attended directors' meeting, laid it out thickly, but few believe this is going to be serious. That's Thursday the 5th of March 2020, we understand it. These entries might be taken, Mr Thompson, to suggest that Mr Grieve characterised the general mood within the Scottish Government as being one which was not particularly engaged with the emerging threat, despite what appeared to be his concerns about it. Was that an atmosphere which you recognised in the Scottish Government at that time as regards the emerging threat of COVID?
I will turn to the relevant passage in my witness statement to you to answer this. So these straddle the period in which I involved myself in COVID in the Scottish Government. I was in London in the week of the first of the entries that you showed me, so I wasn't part of that COBRA meeting. From recollection.
I'm not suggesting you were, Mr Thompson. I'm just suggesting that you might be someone, given the prominence of your position, to be able to reflect upon these observations made by Mr Grieve.
Absolutely. So I'm rehearsing in my mind which of these discussions might I have been involved in. Possibly the 5th of March, but not the other ones because I wouldn't have been in Scotland. So to answer your question, and forgive me for my drawing myself back into the events of the day, as I say in my witness statement, I was aware of the preparations that were being made for COVID, in the sense that at the meetings of the Scottish Government's executive team, I was hearing from my health and social care counterparts, colleagues, that they were preparing to ramp up for what COVID would mean for us. I think I read in Derek's notes here a frustration that the ramping up, the mobilisation of the Scottish Government is not happening as quickly as he would want to see happen. I agree with that. I don't think that means that the Scottish Government, in the sense that Derek Grieve and his colleagues, I think they were very closely involved in consideration of COVID and the threat that it posed. As I say,
my point, I think, Mr. Thompson, is that their consideration doesn't seem to have led to any sense of urgency about it.
Well, I think they were. I think this is not what you mean, but I think that they thought this was very urgent. What they are trying to do, and Derek is expressing his frustration about this, is to, if you like, spin the flywheel up, and I shared that concern.
That's a convenient moment, Labour.
It is. I shall return. I'm sorry we have to break in the middle of your evidence. I hope you were warned we may have to, Mr. Thompson. I shall return at 1:45.